There was a sheriff named John Harris. He was the kind of man you'd see shaking hands at the church potluck, a smile on his face as he listened to the concerns of his neighbours. John wasn't just the sheriff, he was the town's backbone, a figure of authority who carried his badge with pride and a sense of duty. John had built a life that seemed enviable from the outside. His wife, Melissa, was a devoted partner who had been by his side since their high school days. Together, they raised 2 children, Abigail, a bright 15-year-old with dreams of becoming a doctor, and Joshua, a curious 13-year-old who idolized his father. To the townspeople, they were the perfect family, living in a modest but welcoming home with a white picket fence and a dog named Max roaming the yard. The Harris family was well respected in their community. John's father, Robert Harris, had been a sheriff before him, passing down not only the badge but also the values that came with it. Robert was a retired lawman, a man whose wisdom was often sought after, even in his later years. He was the kind of grandfather who attended Little League games and never missed Sunday dinner. The bond between John and his father seemed unbreakable, rooted in mutual respect and a shared love for their family. Melissa, too, played her role perfectly. She was active in the community, organising bake sales and volunteering at the local library. She was known for her kindness and her devotion to her family, always present at school functions and town events. Her life, like John's, seemed like a picture of stability. The Harris family's small town wasn't a place where secrets were easily kept. With a population small enough that everyone knew each other's business, gossip spread quickly. But for years, John and Melissa managed to keep any cracks in their facade hidden. Their marriage, while not without its challenges, appeared solid to those on the outside. They attended church every Sunday, hosted barbecues in their backyard, and celebrated holidays surrounded by friends and family. John's career as sheriff had spanned nearly 2 decades. He was known for his even-handed approach to justice, often going above and beyond to help those in need. Whether it was assisting a farmer whose livestock had gone missing or comforting a family after a tragedy, John was there. He was the kind of sheriff people trusted, a man who represented safety and security. But beneath the surface of their seemingly idyllic life, there were whispers, quiet murmurs of tension that no one could quite put their finger on. Those closest to the Harris family noticed subtle signs. Melissa seemed distracted at times, her gaze distant during conversations. John, once jovial and quick to laugh, had grown more reserved in recent years, his focus on work taking precedence over his personal life. The tension wasn't visible enough to raise alarms, but it was there, like a faint crack in the foundation of a house that had stood strong for years. And while the Harris family went about their daily lives, their carefully constructed world was on the brink of collapse. For John, his father's role in his life was both a source of pride and a shadow he couldn't escape. Robert had been a revered figure in the community, and John often felt the weight of living up to his father's legacy. Their relationship was complex, built on respect but tinged with unspoken competition. Robert's opinions carried weight in every decision John made, and while the two shared many values, there was an underlying tension that neither addressed openly. Melissa's relationship with Robert was also close, perhaps closer than it should have been. She often sought his advice, confiding in him during moments of doubt. Robert, ever the patriarch, offered his guidance freely, his presence in their lives a constant. But while his involvement seemed well-intentioned, it planted seeds of dependency that would later take root in ways no one could have anticipated. The Harris children, Abigail and Joshua, were blissfully unaware of the undercurrents shaping their family's dynamics. To them, their world was simple and secure. They adored their father, looked up to their mother, and cherished their time with their grandfather. The 3 generations of Harris men were often seen together, at church, at the local diner, or walking through town. To the outside world, they were a symbol of unity and strength. But unity can be fragile, and strength can waver when tested. The Harris family's seemingly perfect life was built on a foundation of trust. And it was that trust that would soon be shattered in ways none of them could have foreseen. What started as a normal family dynamic, one of shared dinners and heartfelt conversations, was about to unravel, exposing secrets that had been hidden for years. The events that followed would leave the town in shock, their perception of the Harris family forever altered. And at the center of it all was John Harris, a man who would soon discover that the people he trusted most were the ones who had betrayed him in ways he could never have imagined. It began as something simple, something no one thought would lead to anything extraordinary, a holiday gift exchanged during a family gathering. The brightly wrapped box contained a DNA testing kit, a popular trend that had been sweeping the nation. People everywhere were using these tests to uncover their ancestry, connect with distant relatives, and trace the roots of their family trees. For John Harris, it seemed like a fun activity, a way to bring his family closer together. He had no reason to believe it would become the key to unlocking a truth that would tear his world apart. John, Melissa, and their 2 children each took the test, swabbing their cheeks and mailing off the samples with little more than curiosity. Weeks went by, and the results arrived quietly in their inboxes, just another email amidst the routine of life. Melissa was the first to read hers, glancing at the information and smiling at the mix of heritage it revealed. Abigail and Joshua excitedly shared their results, marveling at the percentages and trying to imagine the lives of their ancestors. For John, the process was more analytical. He scrolled through the data, noting the percentages, the family matches, and the regions that shaped his lineage. But then something caught his attention, a detail that didn't align with what he knew about his family history. The results for Abigail and Joshua seemed off. He wasn't a geneticist, but even he could tell that something about the DNA relationships didn't make sense. At first, he dismissed it as a mistake. Maybe the samples had been mixed up at the lab. Errors happen, after all. He double-checked the names and identification numbers, ensuring everything matched. But the more he scrutinized the data, the more uneasy he became. According to the results, his children weren't just his children. They were his half-siblings. They shared DNA with him and another close relative in a way that couldn't be ignored. Confusion turned to disbelief as he considered the implications. He reread the report multiple times, hoping he'd misunderstood or that the data was simply wrong. But it wasn't wrong. The DNA didn't lie. His children were biologically connected to someone else in his family. The realization struck like a thunderclap. His father, Robert Harris, had to be the second link in this genetic chain. John didn't confront anyone immediately. He needed proof, something beyond the cold, impersonal results on a screen. He ordered additional tests, sending samples to a different lab under pseudonyms to ensure accuracy. As the days dragged on, the tension in the Harris household grew palpable, though no one but John understood why. He carried the weight of the growing suspicion alone, his mind racing with questions he couldn't yet answer. When the second set of results arrived, they confirmed what he already feared. The children he had raised, loved, and devoted his life to were not entirely his. They were the product of a betrayal so profound that he couldn't bring himself to voice it aloud. Melissa, his wife of nearly 2 decades, had been unfaithful, not with a stranger, but with his own father. The discovery unraveled John in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He spent sleepless nights replaying moments from the past, searching for signs he had missed. The long hours Robert spent at their home under the guise of being a doting grandfather, the occasional lingering glance between Melissa and Robert, the subtle shifts in their behavior, things he had once dismissed as innocent, now took on a sinister undertone. But John needed more than just genetic proof. He needed the truth from Melissa. One evening, when the kids were out with friends and the house was quiet, he confronted her. His voice was steady at first, but the weight of his emotions made it tremble as he laid out the evidence. Melissa didn't deny it. Her face paled and tears welled up in her eyes as she admitted to the affair. She tried to explain, to offer reasons, but her words felt hollow to John, who could barely process what he was hearing. The betrayal cut deeper than anything John had ever experienced. Melissa's confession confirmed the worst of his fears, but it didn't answer the questions that consumed him. How long had it been going on? How could his father, the man he trusted most, have done this to him? And what would this revelation mean for his family moving forward? Melissa begged for forgiveness, insisting that she had ended the affair years ago and that she loved John. But her words did little to soothe his pain. The damage was done, and the trust that had held their family together was shattered. John's world, once so steady and predictable, was now a storm of emotions he couldn't escape. The next confrontation was with Robert. It took every ounce of restraint John had to face his father without letting his anger boil over. The two men met at Robert's home, a place that had once been a haven of comfort for John. Now it felt foreign, tainted by betrayal. Robert didn't deny the affair either. He admitted to it with a calmness that enraged John. There was no apology, no remorse in his voice. Instead, Robert tried to justify his actions, framing them as a lapse in judgment, a mistake he had hoped would remain buried, but his words only deepened John's sense of betrayal. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about the destruction of a family, the loss of trust, and the ripple effects that would forever alter their lives. For days, John wrestled with what to do. As a sheriff, he was used to solving problems, bringing order to chaos. But this was a personal crisis that no badge or uniform could fix. He couldn't look at his children without feeling a pang of guilt, knowing they would eventually learn the truth. He couldn't sit across from Melissa without reliving the pain of her betrayal, and he couldn't face his father without the anger rising to the surface. The DNA test, meant to bring families closer together, had instead unearthed a secret so devastating that it threatened to destroy everything John held dear. And as the days turned into weeks, the weight of that secret became too much to bear. What happened next would leave a community reeling and a family broken beyond repair. The fallout began the moment the truth was spoken aloud. For weeks, Sheriff John Harris had carried the burden of his discovery alone, his world unraveling in silence. But now the secret was out. The confrontation with his wife, Melissa, and his father, Robert, had broken the fragile thread of composure he'd managed to hold on to. The revelations, once confined to the sterile language of DNA reports, had become raw, undeniable facts that no one could escape. In the days that followed, the Harris household became a battleground of suppressed emotions and strained interactions. The once warm home, filled with laughter and shared meals, now echoed with a silence that felt heavier than words. John and Melissa barely spoke, their exchanges reduced to the essentials of daily life. Every glance between them carried unspoken accusations, every shared space a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered their marriage. For John, the pain wasn't just in the betrayal itself, it was in the ripple effect it had on every part of his life. He couldn't sleep, the events playing on an endless loop in his mind. He found himself replaying moments from the past, questioning everything he thought he knew. The time Robert had insisted on babysitting the kids while Melissa attended a book club. The afternoons when Melissa had gone on errands that seemed to take longer than necessary. Even family holidays, once cherished memories, now felt tainted in hindsight. At work, John struggled to maintain his focus. As sheriff, he was used to being the calm in the storm, the person people turned to in times of crisis. But now he felt like an imposter. Every time he stepped into the office or walked through the town square, he wondered if people could sense the turmoil inside him. He avoided eye contact, kept conversations short, and buried himself in paperwork to avoid facing the world. Melissa, meanwhile, was drowning in guilt. She tried to reach out to John, to explain her actions, but her words always seemed to fall short. She knew there was no justification for what she had done, no way to erase the hurt she had caused. Her attempts to bridge the gap between them only seemed to make things worse, her presence a constant reminder of the betrayal. Even her interactions with Abigail and Joshua felt strained, her maternal instincts clouded by the fear that one day they would learn the truth. The children, oblivious to the storm brewing around them, continued their routines as best they could, but even they could sense that something was wrong. Abigail, ever perceptive, noticed the tension in her parents' voices, the way they avoided each other at the dinner table. Joshua, still too young to fully grasp the complexity of adult emotions, asked his father one evening why he seemed so sad. John, unable to answer without breaking down, simply hugged him and told him everything would be okay. But everything wasn't okay. The confrontation with Robert had left John more conflicted than ever. The man he had idolized his entire life, the person he had aspired to emulate, had betrayed him in the most personal way imaginable. And yet, Robert's calm demeanor during their conversation had infuriated John. There had been no tears, no heartfelt apology, just a detached acknowledgement of what had happened, as if it were a mistake that could be brushed aside. For John, this lack of remorse was the final blow. He began avoiding his father altogether, ignoring his calls and refusing to visit. The absence of their once close relationship didn't go unnoticed by the community. In a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, whispers began to circulate. People speculated about the tension between John and Robert, their theories ranging from a simple disagreement to something far more serious. As the weeks turned into months, the strain began to take its toll. John's health suffered. He lost weight, his face grew pale, and dark circles formed under his eyes. His colleagues noticed the change, but no one dared to ask. The once resilient sheriff had become a shadow of himself, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet resignation. Melissa, too, felt the weight of the town's scrutiny. Though no one knew the full extent of what had happened, she could feel their eyes on her whenever she went to the grocery store or attended church. The warmth she had once felt from her neighbors was replaced by awkward silences and half-hearted smiles. She began withdrawing from the community, her guilt manifesting in isolation. The situation reached its breaking point on a cool autumn evening. John had spent the day working late, trying to avoid going home. When he finally walked through the door, he found Melissa sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of wine half empty beside her. She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying, and for a moment neither of them said a word. "I can't do this anymore, John," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you, and I know I can't fix it. But this silence, it's killing me." John didn't respond immediately. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? To this family?" Melissa nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, John. But I can't keep living like this. We need to figure out a way forward, for the kids, if nothing else." John looked at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep living like this. But the path forward felt impossible to navigate. Every time he looked at her, he saw not the woman he had loved for so many years, but the person who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. That night marked a turning point. John began considering his options, weighing the possibility of divorce against the impact it would have on Abigail and Joshua. Melissa, desperate to salvage what was left of their family, suggested counseling. But John couldn't bring himself to agree. The wounds were too fresh, the betrayal too deep. As the days continued to pass, the cracks in their marriage grew wider. The once solid foundation of trust and love had crumbled, leaving only fragments of what had once been. And though they tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the sake of their children, the tension between them was impossible to ignore. For John, the fallout of the discovery was more than just the unraveling of his marriage. It was the loss of his identity, the shattering of the life he had worked so hard to build. And as he stood on the precipice of an uncertain future, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. What began as a simple DNA test had become a catalyst for a family's destruction, a chain reaction of events that no one could have foreseen. And though the truth had finally come to light, its consequences were far from over. The days following the fallout were marked by an uneasy silence that hung over the Harris household. The initial shock of the revelation had given way to a tense and fragile existence. Every interaction between John and Melissa was laced with unspoken pain and anger, a simmering tension that seemed ready to boil over at any moment. For their children, Abigail and Joshua, life carried on as usual, at least on the surface. But even they couldn't ignore the growing cracks in the family dynamic. John had retreated into himself, spending more and more time at work. For the sheriff of a small Texas town, there were always duties to fulfill. But lately, John had been taking on extra shifts, avoiding the home that had once been his sanctuary. His colleagues noticed the change. The once reliable sheriff now appeared distracted, his mind clearly elsewhere, but no one dared to pry. The community relied on him, and despite his personal struggles, John continued to fulfill his role. Melissa, meanwhile, clung to whatever normalcy she could find. She tried to keep up appearances for the sake of the children, but every moment spent under the same roof as John felt unbearable. The weight of her guilt was matched only by the fear of what might happen next. Robert, once a frequent presence in their lives, had become a ghost. John had made it clear that his father was no longer welcome, and Robert had respected that unspoken boundary, though it did little to ease the tension. It was in this fragile state that the family existed, teetering on the edge of a precipice. John couldn't shake the images that haunted his mind, Melissa and Robert together, the betrayal they had carried out under his nose. It consumed him, colouring every thought and action. And as the weeks dragged on, that anger began to manifest in ways he couldn't control. One night, after yet another sleepless evening, John decided he needed answers that Melissa had been unwilling or unable to provide. He drove to his father's home, the familiar gravel driveway crunching beneath his tires. The house was dark, but John knew Robert was inside. He knocked on the door, his hand trembling slightly, and waited. When Robert opened the door, the expression on his face was unreadable, somewhere between regret and resignation. The conversation that followed was heated. John demanded to know how long the affair had been going on, why Robert had betrayed him in such a way, and whether he had ever truly felt remorse. Robert's answers were evasive, his tone calm in the face of John's growing fury. The encounter ended with John storming out, slamming the door behind him, and leaving Robert standing alone in the dimly lit entryway. But that confrontation only added fuel to the fire. John's anger now felt like a living thing, something he couldn't escape no matter how hard he tried. Every time he looked at Melissa, he saw betrayal. Every time he looked at his children, he saw the complicated truth of their existence, a truth that he could never fully reconcile. The emotional weight of it all was more than he could bear. The breaking point came on a quiet evening in late October. The children were out of the house, spending the night with friends, leaving John and Melissa alone for the first time in days. The atmosphere was tense from the moment John walked through the door. Melissa was seated at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand, staring at the half-empty bottle before her. "Are we just going to keep pretending everything is fine?" John's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold. Melissa looked up, her eyes weary. "I don't know what you want me to say, John. I've apologized. I've told you everything. What more do you want from me?" "I want the truth," John replied, his voice rising. "I want to know why. Why him? Why this family? Why did you destroy everything we had?" Melissa's response was quiet but firm. "I can't give you the answers you're looking for, John. I made a mistake, an unforgivable one, I know. But you have to stop torturing yourself or it's going to destroy you." The argument escalated quickly. Years of pain, betrayal, and unresolved emotions spilled out in a torrent of words. John's voice grew louder, his anger spilling over into his movements. He paced the room, his fists clenching and unclenching, his body language that of a man on the edge. Melissa, for her part, tried to remain calm, but her own frustration and guilt boiled over. "You think you're the only one hurting, John? Do you think I don't regret what I did every single day?" "You're not the only victim here." That was when something in John snapped. The culmination of weeks, months, years of suppressed anger and betrayal reached its peak. What happened next would shock even seasoned investigators who would later piece together the events of that fateful night. The Harris home, once a place of warmth and love, became the scene of an unimaginable act. When the sun rose the next morning, the house stood eerily silent. Neighbours noticed that the usual sounds of life, laughter, the television, the dog barking, were absent. It wasn't until one concerned friend stopped by later that day that the horrifying truth was uncovered. Inside the home, the evidence told a chilling story. 2 bodies lay lifeless in the kitchen, the remnants of the argument scattered around them. Blood stained the once pristine floors, a stark contrast to the warmth the space had once represented. The sheriff's service weapon lay nearby, its presence a haunting reminder of the power it held and the devastation it had wrought. John Harris, the once revered sheriff, was taken into custody later that day. His face, pale and emotionless, betrayed none of the turmoil that had led to this moment. As he was led away in handcuffs, the small town of Huntsville, Texas, was left to grapple with the unthinkable. How had their sheriff, their protector, their neighbor, come to commit such a heinous act? The days that followed would bring more questions than answers, as investigators began to unravel the details of that fateful night. For the Harris family, the fallout had reached its devastating conclusion, leaving a community reeling and a legacy forever marred. And for John, the man who had once stood for justice, the journey ahead would be one of reckoning, filled with the haunting echoes of a life torn apart by betrayal and rage. The investigation into the events of that October night began as soon as the crime scene was discovered. Local law enforcement, many of whom had worked under Sheriff John Harris for years, were now tasked with unraveling the shocking crime that had unfolded in his home. For a department accustomed to small-town disputes and routine investigations, the gravity of this case was unprecedented. From the moment officers arrived at the scene, the evidence told a grim story. The bodies of Melissa Harris and Robert Harris were found in the kitchen, their lifeless forms marked by gunshot wounds. Melissa had been shot once in the chest, while Robert suffered a fatal wound to the head. Blood spattered the walls and floor, a stark reminder of the violence that had erupted within the family's home. The sheriff's service weapon was recovered nearby, its grip still warm when officers entered the house. John Harris was found sitting on the front porch, his head in his hands, his face blank with shock. When officers approached him, he didn't resist. His voice was calm but detached as he stated, "I did it. I couldn't take it anymore." Those words, simple yet chilling, would later be used against him in court. The initial investigation focused on gathering forensic evidence to confirm John's account of what had happened. Ballistics tests confirmed that the bullets recovered from the victims matched the weapon found at the scene. Gunshot residue tests on John's hands further corroborated his involvement. The timeline of events began to take shape through physical evidence and witness accounts, though the emotional weight of the case made it difficult for many involved to process. Neighbors recalled hearing raised voices from the Harris home earlier that evening, but didn't think much of it. Arguments weren't uncommon in any household, and no one suspected it would escalate to violence. It wasn't until the following day, when a concerned neighbor had stopped by and discovered the gruesome scene, that the full extent of the tragedy came to light. As investigators combed through the Harris home, they found more than just physical evidence. Melissa's phone, recovered from the kitchen counter, contained text messages between her and Robert dating back years. The messages revealed an ongoing affair, one that had persisted long enough to make it clear this was no fleeting mistake. The discovery of these texts provided a crucial motive, painting a picture of betrayal that had driven John to his breaking point. The DNA test results that had started it all were also entered into evidence. These results, which revealed that Abigail and Joshua were not entirely John's biological children, became a central piece of the narrative. Prosecutors argued that the weight of this revelation, combined with the affair, had led John to commit the murders in a fit of rage. The trial of John Harris drew national attention, turning the small Texas town into a media circus. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, their cameras capturing every moment as John was led inside in handcuffs. For a man who had spent his life upholding the law, the sight of him as a defendant was a stark and unsettling image. In court, the prosecution presented a compelling case. They detailed the events leading up to the murders, using forensic evidence, witness testimony, and John's own confession to paint a picture of premeditation. Prosecutors argued that John's actions were not those of a man acting in self-defense, but of someone seeking revenge for the betrayal he had endured. The defense, on the other hand, portrayed John as a broken man, overwhelmed by the weight of his discovery. They emphasized his years of service as a sheriff, his reputation as a devoted family man, and the emotional turmoil he had faced in the weeks leading up to the murders. The defense argued that John had acted in a moment of temporary insanity, driven by a combination of anger, grief, and betrayal. Witnesses were called to testify on both sides. Friends and colleagues spoke of John's dedication to his community, describing him as a man of integrity who had always put others before himself. But the prosecution countered with testimony from forensic experts who detailed the cold, methodical nature of the crime scene. They pointed to the positioning of the bodies, the trajectory of the bullets, and the lack of defensive wounds, all of which suggested that Melissa and Robert had been caught off guard. The most emotional testimony came from Abigail, John and Melissa's 15-year-old daughter. Speaking through tears, she described her father as a loving and protective figure, someone she had always looked up to. But she also spoke of the tension that had consumed their family in the weeks leading up to the murders, painting a picture of a household on the brink. As the trial progressed, the jury was faced with the daunting task of deciding John's fate. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but the emotional complexity of the case made it difficult to assign blame. Was John a cold-blooded killer, or a man pushed to his limits by circumstances beyond his control? In the end, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of murder. John Harris was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that reflected the gravity of his actions. For the community, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it also left behind a lingering sadness. The man they had once trusted to protect them was now a convicted killer, his legacy forever tarnished. Abigail and Joshua, the children caught in the middle of this storm, are perhaps the most poignant reminders of the collateral damage caused by secrets and lies. They are left to navigate a world where their family's name is forever linked to betrayal and violence. How will they carry the weight of their parents' actions? How will they define their own paths in the shadow of such a devastating legacy? For the rest of us, the story raises questions that are as uncomfortable as they are necessary. How well do we really know the people we love? How do we rebuild after trust is broken? And how do we stop pain and anger from consuming us to the point where we lose sight of who we are? John Harris will spend the rest of his life behind bars, reflecting on the choices that led to his downfall. But his story leaves behind lessons for all of us. That betrayal, no matter how well hidden, has consequences. That anger, when left unchecked, can destroy not just individuals but entire families. And that trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to repair. In the end, the Harris family's tragedy serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the power of truth, the danger of secrets, and the devastating ripple effects of betrayal. It is a story that asks us to look inward, to consider the fragility of the relationships we hold dear, and to remember that even the strongest foundations can crumble when trust is taken for granted. As the quiet streets of Huntsville, Texas try to move forward, the echoes of this story remain. It is a story that will linger in the memories of those who lived it and serve as a chilling reminder for generations to come. The choices we make in the shadows will always find their way into the light, and when they do, the consequences can be more devastating than we could ever imagine.